what we're basically doing at Radiator Labs is we're finding data that no one knew was there, and we're using it to extract more efficiency from systems. So my background is in engineering. I'm a material scientist and an electrical engineer. I got my PhD at Columbia. My entire research is on solar power. So why am I talking about radiators? It's because I lived in a horrible graduate housing. I always ask this question: how many people have ever lived in an apartment with a radiator? And how many of you have opened the window in the middle of the winter because it was too hot? Yeah, it's an enormous problem, and it's not just New York City, although New York City I would say is the capital of steam heat of America, but it's across the world. And one of the numbers I like to throw out there is if you crack your window an inch and you leave it open overnight, it's actually equivalent to leaving your refrigerator open for a week. That's how much energy is inherent to this heating process. It's enormously wasteful. Okay, so the issue here in these steam-heated buildings, and this is inherent to a lot of these central heating systems, is that you have a building that's consuming energy, but the distribution of that may not be well controlled. And this is exacerbated in steam. So you have a central plant that is producing steam, and it goes around to the building, and actually these buildings were well balanced when they were built 80 years ago. But then we invented double pane insulating glass, and that totally destroyed the balance in these old buildings. So what you have to do now is you cater to the worst apartment, the coldest apartment, and everyone else gets vastly overheated. And this is because someone complains, the super turns up the heat, and then someone complains they're too hot, they just tell them to open their windows. So the issue here is really distribution, and Radiator Labs has developed a very simple way to address that. It's essentially a glorified oven mitt with a thermostatically controlled fan. And without going into too much details, what we're able to do is manipulate thermodynamically where energy is being directed within a building, so we can push heat from hot apartments to cold apartments and heat cold apartments up faster. And we tell the boiler exactly when it should be on and when it should be off, because all these things are wireless, and we gather that data. And so essentially we're taking all this data that no one knew was there, and you could figure it out, but it'd be really expensive. We're doing it, and we're pulling it out cheaply and then deriving the building based on that. And so when you're able to do this, you're able to save an enormous amount of energy. You're able to make people comfortable, so they close their windows. I'll talk about that more in a second. The estimate for this amount of waste, NYSERDA, and which most of us are familiar with, and the DOE estimate that about 30% of the energy produced in these buildings, in steam-heated buildings, is wasted. And a lot of experts and people who know more about this would say that's crazy. Our system, the Radiator Labs, we purport then to save 30%. People are like, no, you're going to save 10, 15 maybe. So the next slide is one of two buildings we have. This is actually energy efficiency. I'm very glad that I used this slide. So this is BTUs per square foot per heating degree day. This is essentially a snapshot of different kinds of buildings and how much energy they consume. And this is affordable housing, essentially not low-income housing, but not buildings where rich people live. On the left, you can see the worst performing buildings. On the right, you can see the best performing buildings, and they're kind of chopped up into three categories. This building we did in New York City up at Columbia is a two-pipe building. Doesn't need to be defined what that is, but before it was a pretty badly building. It was badly performing, and after our retrofit, just by doing this, we saved actually 35% in the energy it consumed. So an enormous difference, way more than actually we even thought we'd be able to do, just by gathering that data, just by controlling the boiler based on it. The second slide, the slide after this, is another building. This is a single-pipe building, not outlier in terms of energy efficiency beforehand. This building saved 38%. So two of two buildings, we exceeded our goals pretty dramatically. And a lot of people talk about, if you I heard a lot of people talking about turning your thermostat down. You can do that, and that saves energy. These buildings, all the rooms were set at 75 degrees because Columbia University didn't want their students being unhappy. And all we did here was incentivize people to close their windows. And that is all you need to do for a lot of these existing building stocks to save massive amounts of energy.
For those of us who come from somewhere else, it's always startling that the US has a different temperature setting for summer and winter. For example, the room we're in now is very cold,
right,
for me.
Yes.
And it's very warm outside. So I could risk the proposition that it could be un-American to not waste energy.
Right.
No, that's.
So you could argue that
sign of weakness.
The 30% is
and it's a status thing, right?
Is affirming cultural status. So again, one might want an army of of cultural operatives to sort of address this issue of how to make it cool, or how to make it American, not to be, to be more efficient. It is an astonishing. It's not just that there's a difference in the temperature setting; it's an enormous difference.
Right.
The human body being more or less the same in both cases.
Yeah, I mean, the problem in New York City is that people, just because the last 60 years, you go home and you get down to your T-shirt, and that's how you live in your apartment. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard for people to understand that that is unreasonable.
So, but is California, you get the same?
Well, California is this goes back to my point about how all these things are completely regional. Yeah. So I grew up in Wisconsin, I have lived on the East Coast, and I now live in California. And the three places are completely different in this regard. So in the Midwest, it is culturally not okay to turn your thermostat up to 75 degrees. I mean, that is just wasteful. There's a real cultural feeling against waste in much of the Midwest. For whatever reason, it's a more middle-class place, and a lot of people are European, they're Lutherans. I don't know, there's a lot of reasons for that. But California is we just don't have this kind of temperature extreme. So our buildings are, as people know who design out there, they have no insulation, basically. I mean, they have single-pane windows. We have no screens because we don't have bugs. We have very little anything. And people mostly live indoors and outdoors pretty seamlessly in a lot of places. Though we do have a fair amount of waste in a number of our buildings because they're not designed for good control. So I think it is. I think one of the things that emerges out of this for me, and has emerged out of all the climate and energy work that I've done, is again this issue that we not only have cultural responses in the United States to these issues, but they're very regional. So they're not even the same across the United States. We have completely different worlds in these different 8 regions that the National Climate Assessment did, and completely different reactions to this kind of thing. In Madison, Wisconsin, the utility requires, you can see, and you have been able to for 5 or 10 years, you can see not only your own house's energy performance, but the energy performance of your house for the last 10 years, and so can everybody else. So we can all compare it to our neighbors and see what it was over time. And when you buy a house, you're like, how does this house perform? And everyone knows that because they're obsessed with energy saving. It's just a completely different world.